Imagine an ancient Christian text so ancient it might predate some of the books of the New Testament. This is the Didache, or the teachings of the 12 apostles. Likely written in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, it's essentially an early Christian how-to guide, outlining instructions on baptism, prayer, fasting, and spotting false prophets. The text also describes how Christian life and institutions began to formalize. The Didache begins with an ethical essay called The Two Ways, the way of life and the way of death. The way of life is basically ethical teachings about loving God, loving your neighbor, turning the other cheek, and following commandments against murder, theft, and adultery. The way of death warns against pride, greed, deceit, and exploiting the poor. This theme of the way of life and the way of death likely draws from earlier Jewish traditions, like what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which highlights how early Christians adapted Jewish ethics into their own context. The Didache also gives practical instructions for how to conduct rituals like baptism. According to the Didache, baptism should ideally be done in cold flowing water, but pouring water 3 times over the head suffices in a pinch. It also says to fast on Wednesdays and Fridays and not on Mondays and Thursdays, which it calls the practice of hypocrites, which is possibly a reference to Jewish practice at the time. The Didache also has instructions for how to conduct the Eucharist, with a version of the Lord's Prayer nearly identical to the one found in the Gospel of Matthew. The Didache places a strong emphasis on distinguishing outsiders versus insiders. For example, it criticizes those who fast or pray differently and warns against sharing the Eucharist with non-Christians. Leadership is another focus. The Didache warns against false prophets with rules for spotting frauds. If a traveling prophet stays longer than 2 days or asks for money, they're likely a fake. True prophets rely on hospitality without exploiting it. This tension between charismatic traveling prophets and local church leaders hints at early power struggles as authority shifted from individuals to institutions. So why wasn't the Didache included in the New Testament? Now, some Christians may have considered it scripture. The theologians Clement of Alexandria and Origen of Alexandria seem to quote it authoritatively. However, by the 4th century, church leaders like Eusebius of Caesarea dismissed it as fake. They probably doubted it was written by the apostles. Other scholars have argued that the Didache was outshone by the Gospel of Matthew. The Didache has a lot in common with the Gospel of Matthew, and so the most useful material was already available in the much more accessible form of the Gospel. But the Didache's impact is undeniable. It launched an entire genre of church handbooks called church orders that shaped Christian liturgy and communal life for centuries.